differing from that of the other organizations which play a significant role in public life. Today our views still differ in many points from those of our opponents. It is our conviction that the misery is due not only and not primarily to general world events, for this would more or less exclude from the very onset the possibility that an individual people might better its situation. Were it true that the German misery is necessarily due solely to a so-called world crisis on the course of which we as Volk naturally can exercise no influence or only an insignificant amount of influence, then Germany's future could only be described as hopeless. How should a state of affairs change for which no one bears the blame? In my opinion, the view that the world crisis alone is to blame leads in the long run to a dangerous pessimism. It is only natural that the more the factors giving rise to a certain state of affairs are removed from an individual's sphere of influence, the more that individual will despair of ever being able to change this state of affairs. The gradual result will perforce be a certain lethargy and indifference, and ultimately perhaps despair. For I believe it is of primary importance to break with the view that our fate is determined by the world. It is not true that the final cause of our misery lies in a world crisis, in a world catastrophe. What is true is that we have slipped into a general crisis because certain mistakes were made here from the very beginning. I cannot say. The general view is that the Peace Treaty of Versailles is the cause of our misfortune. What is the Peace Treaty of Versailles other than the work of man? It is not something which has been burdened or imposed upon us by Providence. It is the work of man for which, quite naturally, once again men will have to be held responsible with their merits and with their faults. If this were not so, how would man ever be able to do away with this work at all?
The revived flight will arrive.
It is my opinion that there is nothing which has been caused by the will of man, which cannot in turn be changed by another man's will. Both the Peace Treaty of Versailles, as well as all of the consequences of this treaty, are the result of a policy which was perhaps regarded as being correct, at least in the enemy nations, some 15, 14, or 13 years ago. Seen from our vantage point, it can only be seen as fatal, even though it was still supported by millions of Germans a mere 10 years or less ago, and only today stands revealed in its utter impossibility. Hence, I must conclude that there is some implicit blame for these events in Germany as well, if I want to believe at all that the German Volk can still exercise some influence toward changing these conditions. It is, in my opinion, also false to claim that today's life in Germany is determined solely by considerations of foreign policy. That the primacy of foreign policy today controls the whole of our domestic life. It is naturally possible for a people to reach a point where factors of foreign policy exclusively influence and determine its domestic life. But let no one say that this circumstance is either natural or was intended from the onset. Rather, the important thing is for a people to lay the necessary groundwork to alter this state of affairs. If anyone tells me that foreign politics are the foremost determining factor in the life of a people, then I must first ask, what do you mean by politics? There are a number of definitions. Frederick the Great said, politics is the art of serving one's state with every means. Bismarck stated, politics is the art of the possible, based upon the concept that everything within the realm of possibility should be done to serve the state, and in the subsequent transition to the concept of nationalities, the nation. Yet another considers that this service to the people can be effected by peaceful as well as military means. For Clausewitz said, war is the continuation of politics, albeit with different means. Conversely, Clemenceau believed that peace today is nothing other than the continuation of the battle and the pursuit of the battle aim, although once again, with different means. In short, politics is and can be nothing other than the realization of the vital interests of a people and the practical waging of its life battle with all means available. Thus, it is quite clear that this life battle has its initial starting point in the people itself, and that at the same time the people is the object, the value in and of itself, which is to be preserved. All of the functions of this body politic should ultimately fulfill only one purpose, securing the preservation of this body in the future. Therefore, I can neither say that foreign policy is of primary significance, nor that economic policy has priority. Naturally, a people will require an economy in order to live, but this economy is also only one of the functions the body politic requires for its existence. Primarily, however, the most essential thing is the starting point itself, namely the people in and of itself. One should not say that foreign politics are of prime importance in determining the path of a people. Rather, one must say that, first of all, It is the people, with its own intrinsic value, with its organization and training in this value, which marks out its own path within the world around it. I should not say that foreign policy is capable of changing the value of the people to any significant extent. Rather, I must say, each people must wage the battle to safeguard its own interests and can only wage a battle which corresponds to its innermost nature, its value, its capabilities, the quality of its organization, etc. Naturally, foreign policies will in turn exercise their retrospective influence. We ourselves have experienced it. What a difference there is in the reactions of the individual peoples to foreign policies. The reaction is determined by the inner state of mind, by the inner value, by the inner disposition, by the capabilities of each individual people. Thus, I can ascertain that even if the basic value of a nation is constant, shifts in the inner organization of the life of this nation can suffice to give rise to a change in its attitude to the external world. Therefore, it would be wrong to claim that foreign policy shapes a people. Rather, the peoples control their relations to the rest of the world respective to the forces inherent in them, and respective to their education in the utilization of these forces. We can be quite certain that had a different Germany stood in the place of today's Germany, the attitude to the rest of the world would also have been appreciably different. However, presumably the influences of the rest of the world would also have manifested themselves in other ways. Denial of this would mean that Germany's destiny could no longer be changed, no matter which regime is governing in Germany. The roots underlying such a belief and the explanation for it are obvious. Assertions that the destiny of a people is determined solely by foreign countries have always been the excuses of bad governments. Weak and bad governments throughout the ages have made use of this argument in order to excuse their own failures or those of their predecessors. The failures of their entire tradition-bound, predetermined course. And in order to claim from the very beginning, no one else in my position could have done otherwise. For what could anyone do with his people against conditions which are firmly established and rooted in the rest of the world, with a people which is then naturally regarded as a fixed value as well? My view in this respect is another. I believe that three factors essentially influence the political life of a people. First of all, the inner value of a people, which is passed down from one generation to the next as inheritance and genotype. A value which only suffers any change when the carrier of this inheritance, the people itself, changes in terms of its genetic composition. It is a certain fact that individual character traits, individual virtues, and individual vices always recur in peoples as long as their inner nature, their genetic composition, does not undergo any essential change. I can see the virtues and vices of our German folk in the Roman authors just as clearly as I perceive them today. This inner value, which determines the life of the people, can be destroyed by nothing save a genetic change in its very substance. An illogical organization of life or an unreasonable education may interfere with this value temporarily, but in this case, merely its outward effects are obstructed, while the basic value in and of itself continues to exist as it has before. This is the great source of all hope for the recovery of a people. Here lies the justification for believing that a people which, in the course of thousands of years, has exhibited countless examples of the highest inner value, cannot suddenly have lost this inborn, genetically transmitted value from one day to the next. Rather, that this people will one day again bring this value into play. Were this not the case, the belief of millions of people in a better future, the mystic hope for a new Germany, would be incomprehensible. It would be incomprehensible how this German Volk, depleted from 18 to 13.5 million people at the end of the 30 Years' War, could regain the hope of rising again by means of industriousness and efficiency, how hundreds of thousands and finally millions belonging to this utterly crushed Volk could once again be seized by the yearning for a new form of government. It would be inconceivable, were there not a certain unconscious conviction in all of these individuals that a value was present in and of itself, which manifested itself time and time again throughout the millenniums, perhaps repressed and hindered in its effectiveness at times by bad leadership, bad education, bad organization within the state, but which in the end always struggled its way through presenting to the world over and over again the wonderful spectacle of our Volk rising anew. I said that this value can be corrupted. In particular, however, there are still two other inwardly related phenomena which we can observe again and again in periods of national decline. One of these is the substitution in democracy of a leveling numerical concept for the value of the individual. The other is the negation of the value of the people, the denial that there is diversity in the natural abilities, achievements, etc., of the individual peoples. In fact, each of these two phenomena is mutually dependent upon the other, or at least exerts an influence on the other's development. Internationalism and democracy are inseparable concepts. It is only logical that democracy, which negates the special value of the individual within the people and puts in its place a general value, a numerical value, must proceed in this same way in respect to the life of the people, and there it degenerates to internationalism. It is maintained in a general sense that peoples have no innate values. Rather, at most, there may be manifestations of temporary differences as a result of education. But there is no essential difference in value between Negroes, Aryans, Mongolians, and Redskins. This view, which constitutes the basis of our entire international body of thought today, is so far-reaching in its consequences that ultimately a Negro will be able to preside at the sessions of the League of Nations. It leads perforce in turn to the further consequence that within a single people, in the same way, any differences between the value of individual members of this people will be particularly disputed. In this way, of course, any existing special ability, any existing basic value of a people can, for all practical purposes, be made ineffective. For with this view, the greatness of a people is not the sum of all its achievements, but rather ultimately a sum of its outstanding achievements. Let no one say that the image which is conveyed as the first impression of the culture of mankind is the impression of its overall achievement. This entire structure of culture, down to its foundations and in each of its building blocks, is nothing other than the result of creative talent, the achievement of intelligence, and the industriousness of individuals. The greatest results are the great crowning achievement of individual geniuses endowed by God. The average results are the achievement of men of average ability, and the total result is undoubtedly a product of the application of human working power towards the exploitation of the creations of geniuses and talented men. But this naturally means that when the capable minds of a nation who are always in the minority are given a value equal with all the others, this must result in subjugating the genius to the majority, in subjecting the ability and the value of the individual to the majority, a process which is mistakenly called the rule of the people. This is not the rule of the people, but in fact the rule of stupidity, of mediocrity, of half measures, of cowardice, of weakness, and of inadequacy. The rule of the people is rather when a people allows itself to be governed and led in all areas of life by its most capable individuals who are born for the task, than to allow all areas of life to be administered by a majority which, by its very nature, is alien to these areas. In this way, however, democracy will, in practice, result in canceling out the real values of a people. This is one of the reasons why peoples with a great past slowly forfeit their former status from the very point onwards when they submit to unlimited democratic rule by the masses. For the existing and potentially outstanding achievements of the individual in all areas of life are then practically ruled ineffective, thanks to being subjected to rape by numbers. But this means that such a people will gradually lose not only its cultural and not only its economical significance, but also its significance as a whole. In a relatively short time, it will no longer represent to the rest of the world the value it once did. And this will necessarily be accompanied by a shift in its ability to safeguard its interests in respect to the rest of the world.
The airdrop is coming.
It is not inconsequential whether a people embarks on a period such as, for instance, 1807 to 1813, under the leadership of the most capable individuals who are granted extraordinary authority, or whether in a similar period, such as 1918 to 1921, it marches under the leadership of parliamentary mass madness. In the one case, one observes that the inner rebuilding of the life of the nation has led to the highest achievements which, though certainly founded in the value of the people, are only then capable of being manifested, while in the other case, even the value which already exists no longer manifests itself. Yes, things can proceed to the point when an unquestionably industrious people, in whose lifetime apparently very few changes have taken place, particularly in respect to the efforts of individuals, loses so much in terms of its overall achievement that this achievement is no longer of any significance to the rest of the world. But there is yet another factor involved, namely the view that having already denied the value of the individual and and the particular value of a people, life on this planet must not necessarily be maintained through conflict, an opinion which perhaps might be of no import had it only become implanted in individual minds, but which has appalling consequences because it is slowly poisoning an entire people. It is not as though these types of general changes in the Weltanschauung are confined to the surface or involve purely intellectual processes. No, in the long run they affect the very roots, influencing all of the expressions of a people's life. I may cite an example. You gentlemen are of the opinion that the construction of the German economy must be based upon the concept of private property. Then again, you can only maintain the idea of private property if it appears to be somehow founded in logic. This concept must draw its ethical justification from the insight that it is a necessity dictated by nature. It cannot, for instance, be motivated solely by the claim, "It has been this way until now, and therefore it must continue this way." For in periods of great upheavals in the state, of movements of peoples, and of transitions in thought institutions, systems, etc., cannot only remain unaffected because they have existed previously in the same form. It is characteristic of all truly great revolutionary epochs in the history of mankind that they pass over, with unparalleled ease, forms which have become sacred only with time, or which only apparently become sacred with time. Thus, it is necessary to justify these types of traditional forms, which are to be preserved in such a manner that they can be regarded as absolutely necessary and as logical and right. In that case, I must say one thing. Private property is only morally and ethically justifiable if I assume that men's achievements are different. Only then can I say that because men's achievements are different, the results of those achievements are also different. But if the results of men's achievements are different, then it is expedient to leave the administration of these achievements to men to an appropriate degree. It would be illogical to assign the administration of the fruits of an achievement connected to one individual to the next best, less capable individual or the whole. For these latter individuals have already proven, by the simple fact that they themselves have not performed the achievement, that they cannot be capable of administering the resulting product. Therefore, one must admit that from an economic point of view, men are not equally valuable, not equally significant in every area from the onset. Having admitted this, it would be madness to claim that, while there are doubtless differences in value in the economic sector, there are none in the political sector. It is nonsense to base economic life on the concept of achievement, of personal value, and thus practically on the authority of the individual, while denying this authority of the individual in the political sphere and substituting in its place the law of the greater number democracy. This will inevitably slowly cause a gulf between the economic view and the political view, which one will attempt to bridge by assimilating the former to the latter, an attempt which has indeed been made, for this gulf has not remained pure empty theory. The concept of the equality of values has meanwhile been raised to a system not only in the political, but also in the economic sector. And not only as an abstract theory, no, this economic system thrives in gigantic organizations, yet today it has already seized the huge territory of an entire state. I am, however, incapable of regarding two basic ideas as being the possible foundation for the life of a people for any length of time. If it is correct to assume that human achievements are different, then it must also be correct that the value of man in respect to the creation of certain achievements is different. But then it is absurd to attempt to apply this only in respect to a certain sphere, in the sphere of economy and its leadership, but not in the sphere of leadership in the life struggle as a whole, namely in the sphere of politics. Rather, it is only logical that if I acknowledge the unequivocal recognition of particular achievements in the sphere of economy as the prerequisite for any higher culture, then politically I must similarly grant priority to the particular achievement and thus to the authority of the individual. If, on the other hand, it is asserted by none other than the economic sphere that no particular abilities are required in the political sector, but that absolute uniformity reigns here in respect to achievement, then one day this same theory will be transferred from politics to the economy. Political democracy, however, is analogous to communism in the economic sector. Today we find ourselves in an age in which these two basic principles are in conflict with each other on every border, and have already penetrated the economy. One example, the practical activity of life is rooted in the significance of the individual. This is gradually becoming threatened by the rule of numbers in the economic sector. There is, however, one organization in the state, the Army, which cannot be democratized in any way whatsoever without surrendering its very essence. One proof that a Weltanschauung is weak is when it is inapplicable to all areas of life as a whole. In other words, the Army can only exist if the absolutely anti-democratic principle of unconditional authority from above and absolute responsibility from below are maintained, while in contrast, democracy means, for all practical purposes, complete dependency from above and authority from below. However, the result is that in a state in which the whole of political life, beginning with the community and ending with the Reichstag, is built upon the concept of democracy, the Army must gradually become an alien body, and an alien body which is bound to be perceived as an alien body. To democracy, it is an alien idea, an alien Weltanschauung which inspires this body. An internal struggle between the advocates of democracy and the advocates of authority is the inevitable consequence, a struggle we are now experiencing in Germany. One cannot expect that this struggle will suddenly come to a standstill. No, the opposite is the case. This struggle will continue until the nation ultimately becomes immersed in either internationalism or democracy, and thus falls prey to a complete dissolution, or else creates a new and logical form for its inner life. It follows that education in pacifism must of necessity affect even the most insignificant of individual lives. The concept of pacifism is logical if I proceed on the basis of a general equality between peoples and human beings. For what other sense could there be in struggling? The concept of pacifism, translated into practical reality and in all sectors, must slowly lead to the destruction of the drive for competition, of the ambition to bring forth particular achievements of all types. I cannot say, in politics we will become pacifists, we'll rid ourselves of the notion that it is necessary to protect life by means of conflict, but in economics we wish to remain keen competitors. If I eliminate the idea of struggle as such, it is of no significance that it still exists in isolated areas. In the end, political decisions will determine individual achievements. You can build up the best economy for 50 years on the basis of the principle of authority, on the basis of the principle of achievement. You can construct factories for 50 years. You can amass wealth for 50 years, and in 3 years of inadequate political decisions, you can destroy all the results of these 50 years. This is only natural because political decisions spring from a different root than constructive economic decisions. In summary, I see two principles starkly opposed. The principle of democracy, which, wherever its practical results are evident, is the principle of destruction, and the principle of the authority of the individual, which I would like to call the principle of achievement. Because everything which mankind has achieved until now and all human cultures are only conceivable given the rule of this principle. The value of a people in and of itself, the type of inner organization through which this value is to be made effective, and the type of education are the starting points for the political action of a people, and thus the foundations for the results of this action. Do not go so far as to believe that a people which has deprived itself of its values, to the extent the German Volk has, would have fared better in former centuries, whether there was a world crisis or not. When a people chooses the path which we have chosen practically for the past 30 or 35 years, but officially for the past 13, then it can end nowhere else but where Germany is today. The fact that evidence of the crisis has spread throughout almost the entire world is understandable when one considers that the development of the world has today progressed to an extent, and mutual relations have been reinforced in a manner which seemed scarcely possible 50, 80, or 100 years ago. But it would nevertheless be wrong to believe that this process is only conceivable now, in the year 1932. No, the history of the world has witnessed similar things more than once before. Whenever particular relations between peoples have led to situations being created accordingly, the disease of these peoples has necessarily spread and influenced the overall situation. It is, of course, easy to say. We prefer to wait until the general situation has changed. That is impossible. The situation which you see before you today is surely not the consequence of some revelation of God's will, but the result of human weaknesses, human errors, human fallacies. It is only natural that first of all, these causes must be transformed, and thus mankind committed to an internal transformation, before one can count on a change in the situation. This follows from a single look at the situation of the world today. We have a number of nations which have created for themselves an outlook on life based upon their inborn superior value, which bears no relation to the Lebensraum they inhabit in densely populated areas. We have the so-called white race, which has, in the course of some 1,000 years since the collapse of ancient civilization, established for itself a privileged position in the world. But I am incapable of comprehending the economically privileged supremacy of the white race over the rest of the world if I do not view it in the closest of connections to a political concept of supremacy, which has been peculiar to the white race as a natural phenomenon for many centuries, and which it has upheld as such to the outer world. You can choose any single area. Take, for example, India. England did not acquire India in a lawful and legitimate manner, but rather without regard to the natives' wishes, views, or declarations of rights. And she maintained this rule, if necessary, with the most brutal ruthlessness. Just as Cortez or Pizarro demanded for themselves Central America and the northern states of South America, not on the basis of any legal claim, but from the absolute inborn feeling of superiority of the white race. The settlement of the North American continent was similarly a consequence, not of any higher claim in a democratic or international sense, but rather of a consciousness of what is right, which had its sole roots in the conviction of the superiority, and thus the right of the white race. If I imagine things without this frame of mind, which in the course of the last 3 or 4 centuries of the white race has conquered the world, then the fate of this race would in fact be no other than that, for instance, of the Chinese, an immensely congested mass of people in an extraordinarily restricted territory, overpopulation with all its inevitable consequences. If fate allowed the white race to take a different path, it was because this white race was of the conviction that it had a right to organize the rest of the world. Regardless of what external disguise this right assumed in a given case in reality, it was the exercise of an extraordinarily brutal right to dominate. From this political view, there evolved the basis for the economic takeover of the rest of the world. A famous Englishman once wrote that the characteristic feature of English policy was this miraculous marriage of economic acquisitions with political consolidation of power, and conversely, the political expansion of power with immediate economic appropriation. An interaction which becomes inconceivable the moment one of the two factors is lacking. I know, however, that the view is held that one can also conquer the world economically, but this is one of the greatest and most terrible fallacies there are. Let the English confine their struggle for India to economic means. Let England relinquish in full the attitude with which it once acquired India, an attitude which helped to preserve India for England throughout the many rebellions and the long and bloody battles in the middle of the last century, and you will see what happens. The English factories will not hold India. They will come to a standstill because the spirit of old England, the spirit which once laid the necessary groundwork for these factories, has been lost. Today we are confronted with a world situation which is only comprehensible to the white race if one recognizes as indispensable the marriage between the concept of domination in political will and the concept of domination in economic activity, a miraculous consensus which left its mark on the whole of the past century, and in the consequences of which the white peoples have, in part, undergone a remarkable development. Instead of expanding in a territorial sense, instead of exporting human beings, they have exported goods, have built up a worldwide economic system which manifests itself most characteristically in the fact that, given that there are different standards of living on this earth, Europe, and most recently America as well, have gigantic central world factories in Europe, and the rest of the world has huge markets and sources of raw materials. The white race, however, is capable of maintaining its position, practically speaking, only as long as discrepancies between the standards of living throughout the world remain. If today you were to give our so-called export markets the same standard of living we have, you would witness that the privileged position of the white race, which is manifested not only in the political power of the nation, but also in the economic situation of the individual, can no longer be maintained. The various nations have now, in accordance with their innate natural abilities, safeguarded this privileged position in various ways, perhaps England most ingeniously, for she has consistently tapped new markets and immediately anchored them in a political sense, so that it is quite conceivable that Great Britain, assuming its mental outlook remains unchanged, might develop an economic life more or less independent of the rest of the world. Other peoples have not attained this goal because they have exhausted their mental powers in internal, formally religious battles. During the great period when the world was partitioned, they were developing their capacities internally. And later they attempted to participate in this world economy, but they have never created their own markets and gained complete control of these markets. When Germany, for example, began to establish colonies, the inner conception, this entirely cool, sober English concept of colonization, had already been replaced in part by more or less romantic ideas, the transmission of German culture to the world, the spread of German civilization things, which the English viewed as far removed during the colonial period. Thus, our practical results failed to meet our expectations, aside from the fact that the objects of our endeavors were, in part, no longer capable of fulfilling our lofty and romantic hopes, particularly since the white race has slowly increased to such numerical proportions that the preservation of these gigantic population figures appears guaranteed only if the economic world market potential is secured. Thus, in reality, one part of the world is absolutely dependent upon maintaining a situation which we Germans, as democrats and members of the International League of Nations, have long since rejected in an intellectual sense. The result is obvious. Competition forced the European peoples to an ever-increasing improvement in production, and the increasing improvement in production led to a steady economizing in the labor force. As long as the tapping of new international markets kept pace, the men who had been dispensed with in agriculture and later in the trades could be transferred to the new lines of production without further ado, so that we now perceive the characteristic features of the last century and that primarily men were being eliminated in agriculture and entering the trades. Later in the trades themselves, more and more people fell victim to rationalization in the methods of production and then, in turn, found new opportunities to earn a livelihood in an expansion of the branches of production. But this process was conceivable only as long as there was a constant increase in available sales potential, a potential which had to be as large as the increase in production. The situation in the world today can be summed up as follows. Germany, England, France, and also for non-imperative reasons, the American Union and a whole series of smaller states are industrial nations dependent upon the export business. After the end of the war, all of these peoples were confronted with a world market practically empty of commodities. Then the industrial and manufacturing methods, having become particularly ingenious during the war, in a scientific and theoretical sense, pounced on this great void and began to restructure the factories, invest their capital, and, as the inevitable consequence of the invested capital, to increase production to the utmost. This process was able to work for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. It could have continued to function if new markets had been created which corresponded to the rapid increase and improvement in production and its methods. A matter of primary importance, for the rationalization of the economy leads, from the beginning of the rationalization of basic economy, to a reduction in the human workforce. A reduction which is only useful if the workers who have been dispensed with can easily be transferred in turn to other branches of industry. But we see that since the World War, there has been no substantial increase in the number of markets. Quite the opposite. They have shrunken in number because the number of exporting nations has slowly been increasing. For a host of former sales markets have themselves become industrialized. We see, however, a new major exporter, the American Union, which today has perhaps not manifested itself all powerfully in all sectors, but certainly in individual areas can count on advantages in production which we in Europe do not and cannot possibly possess.
Get some rest, soldier.
The last and most serious phenomenon we observe is the fact that, parallel to the gradual growth of confusion in white European thinking, a Weltanschauung has seized hold of a part of Europe and a large part of Asia, which threatens to actually tear this continent out of the framework of international economic relations, a phenomenon which German statesmen even today pass over with an astonishing lack of regard. For instance, when I hear a speech which stresses, "It is necessary that the German folk stand together," then I am forced to ask, does one really believe that this standing together today is nothing but a question of good political will? Do they fail to see that a gulf has already grown in our midst, a gulf which is not the mere figment of some people's imaginations, but rather whose spiritual exponent today forms the basis for one of the largest world powers? That Bolshevism is not only a mob ranting about in a few streets in Germany, but a worldview which is on the point of subjecting to its rule the entire continent of Asia, and which today, in the form of a state, stretches almost from our eastern border to Vladivostok. Here the matter is presented as though these were only the purely intellectual problems of isolated visionaries or ill-disposed individuals. No, a Weltanschauung has conquered a state, and starting from there will slowly shatter the whole world and bring about its collapse. Bolshevism will, if its advance is not halted, expose the world to a transformation as complete as the one Christianity once effected. In 300 years, people will no longer say, "This is a new idea in production." In 300 years, people might already know that it is almost a new religion, though based upon other principles. In 300 years, if this movement continues to develop, people will see in Lenin not only a revolutionary of the year 1917, but the founder of a new world doctrine, worshipped perhaps like Buddha. It is not true that this gigantic phenomenon could simply, let us say, be thought away in today's world. It is reality and must of necessity destroy and overthrow one of the basic requirements for our continued existence as the white race. We observe the stages of this process.